We've just wrapped up what has been an extraordinary collaborative and productive meeting in the G7.
In a rather significant move, the G7 countries have taken on China, and a tougher line against the country has been put forth through the communique that was issued after the G7 summit in Cornwall in the United Kingdom. This is being described by American officials as a virtual coup for US President Joe Biden, who has been insisting on a tougher line being taken against China. Now, what does the communique say? It talks about human rights violations in China, especially in Xinjiang. It has expressed concern over forced labor in these areas. In fact, it has also spoken about eroding of the autonomy in Hong Kong, and that's not where it stops. It also talks about the aggression of China in the South China Sea.
China has to start to act more responsibly in terms of international norms on human rights and transparency. Transparency matters across the board.
In a press briefing after the G7 summit, the US President Joe Biden said that it almost appears that the world is in contest with China. It is more about democracies versus autocracies, and whether in the 21st century democracies are still relevant and can bear upon autocracies to be more transparent in their dealings. In fact, he said from here on, it will be straightforward talking with China. In this context, the G7 has asked for China to cooperate in a fresh investigation on the origins of the coronavirus. And this certainly is very significant, coming as it does after a report by the World Health Organization already submitted that had ruled out a possibility of the coronavirus being leaked from a lab. However, with fresh evidence emerging that there were at least 3 researchers in the Wuhan Institute of Virology who fell ill in November 2019, there is an impetus now for another probe into the origins of the coronavirus. In fact, US President Joe Biden has given his intelligence community 90 days' time to submit a report on the possibility of a lab leak of the coronavirus.
I'm very pleased to announce that this weekend leaders have pledged over 1 billion doses, either directly or through funding to COVAX.
And even as the world continues to look for the origins of the coronavirus, to study it and ensure that no such situation is faced by the world in future, there is also a need right now to be able to inoculate a vast population so that the pandemic can be brought under control. This too was the focus of the G7 meeting, with the G7 countries looking at donating 1 billion more vaccines to the developing world, out of which 500 million will be donated by the United States. It is here that India stepped in as a G7 invitee this year. India stressed on the need for supply chains to be smoothened for the raw materials and components of vaccine manufacturing. India is the pharmacy of the world, manufacturing over 60% of the world's vaccines, and India stressed on the fact that only grants and donations will not help because they simply are a drop in the ocean with regards to the vast populations across the world. And really the need was to ramp up vaccine production. This thought of India was backed by a majority of the G7 countries as far as supply chains are concerned. Meanwhile, India and South Africa, another country that was invited at the G7 summit this year, laid stress on the fact that there should be an intellectual property and patent waiver of the Covid-19 vaccines. This is a demand that both the countries placed in October last year at the World Trade Organization. After meeting with initial resistance from the European countries and even from the American side, the US administration has now agreed to a text-based negotiation on the issue. Change and Environment session, India underlined the fact that countries cannot work in silos to mitigate a global crisis like climate change, and cooperation is required and is essential on this front. It also asked for countries that have resulted in this sort of glaring climate change and global warming to take onus and responsibility. Meanwhile, zero-emission targets of 2015 were backed by most of the G7 countries. India also participated in another session, Open Societies and Open Economies. Here, Prime Minister Narendra Modi said that some leaders and some societies are particularly vulnerable to cyber attacks and social media threats. The G7, in a statement on this session, said that freedom of expression, both online and offline, are necessary to safeguard democracies.